Hi guys, CG Paul D coming at you with one out of the 3 videos I wanted to do and showing you how to create an underwater bubble effect. Today we'll be using 3D Studio Max and a particle flow system to get the job done. To the right you'll see a viewport representation of what we're actually going to achieve today, which is controlling where the bubbles are emitted from, how they behave, and where they pop. And to the left is me taking a little bit further to show you some production value that you can get out of it. These lessons are definitely catered more towards generalists that are in a fast-paced environment that are looking to take their work a little further. Let's get started. All right, so we have a new scene in Max. I want to start by creating a couple patches of geometry to represent the ocean floor and the surface of the water to kind of help set the stage for our particle flow system. I want to also preface by saying that I will be trying to move pretty swiftly. I'll call out some of the hotkeys, but I'm just going to move forward as if you guys are late beginner, intermediate, and advanced. Again, to kind of keep the momentum going. So we'll start by creating a plane. This will be our ocean floor, so we'll just call it floor for now, it's fine. And we'll just simplify our attributes a little bit. So we'll do 100, 100 for length. We'll add a little resolution so we can add a little flow to the ocean floor to kind of give it aesthetic appeal as we work. And I like to center it in the grid. And to add the curvature, I'm just going to use a noise modifier. It's pretty straightforward. And I've gone through some numbers, so I'm just going to throw them out there. I brought the scale down to 65. Fractal, we're going to go set to 3. And the Z, we're going to move it to 15. So this just kind of distorts it only on the Z axis to give it a little bit of a ocean floor feel. Next, I want to go ahead and hold in Shift and drag it up to go ahead and make the surface of the water. So we just call it water. And I want to spin it around or rotate it 180 degrees so that the normals are facing the proper way for the viewport. I'm going to make some adjustments to the noise to kind of tighten up the water a little bit. So I chose 7.5 for my scale and brought my Z strength down to 1. If the water looks a little bumpy, we can add a little more resolution in the root plane. So I'm just going to kick it up to 80. And what we could also do is just add the little animation in there, just for fun. So if I click on Animate Noise, you already see there's a key down here available for the phases. But right now my timeline's set to 100 by default. So I want to allow a little more time. So I'm going to bump it up to 300. That allows a 10-second window to kind of create our bubble simulation. And I can just drag this phase key over to 300. And then I'm going to set the auto key because I want to change the phases to 125. I'm going to just adjust how many phases the water is going through throughout the timeline. And then I do have my keys set to the wrong tangent curve. So I'm going to just right click, go to my water phase and set it to a linear interpolation. And this allows the water just to consistently move with the ripples instead of having any influence of the tangent curves. All right, turn off my auto key. We have that set up. And now we just get a general camera set up, get a resolution going, so our stage will be complete. One of the ways I like to do that, seems pretty fast and simple to me and a little more accurate, is from here I can go ahead and jump into the front viewport. So this kind of centers me in between my two objects so I have them both selected. And if I hit Z, it brings me in the middle. And then I can change it to the perspective view because you cannot do a quick camera. You can't do a quick camera from an orthographic view. So I hit Control C in my perspective. And then now we're centered in the middle here. We can make a field of view adjustment. I like the 65, it kind of pushes the perspective a little bit. And then we can track in. Kind of get an overall setup. Somewhere around there is good. And since this is our camera, we also want to set up the resolution. So if you hit 9 on the keyboard, it brings up your render settings. And that'll allow us to kind of make those adjustments here. So what we're looking for, it's already set for me, but 1280 by 720. And then we can hold in Shift F and it'll help kind of bracket in our resolution gate here. So now we know what we're working with and our stage is set up. And we can hide our camera if we want. just so it doesn't get in our way. And now we're ready to build our particle flow. Let's go to the create menu, and we'll go from standard primitives to particle systems. And we'll just drop on a PF source. Just do the perspective viewport here, it doesn't matter. And by default, the icon's pointing down. I usually like to make sure the icon's pointing in the general direction I want my flow to go. More for visual purposes, but it also gets the initial direction off the ground. Go ahead and center it in the grid, and let's make some adjustments. If you hit 6 on the keyboard, it brings up your particle view. And right away, the names are a little funky, so we can go ahead and switch these to PF bubbles. And while we're in the main system parameters, I like to make a couple adjustments. The quantity multiplier, by default, it's set to 50% in the viewport, so I'm not truly seeing all of my particles that I'm messing with. And if you're having a manageable amount of particles in your scene, you might as well have it 100 so you understand what you're working with. And I do like to add the integration steps to sync these two up, the viewport and render. And I set them to half frame just to add a little more quality, another subframe of calculation there. Event 001, we can go ahead and rename this to, let's just say, bubble emit. So we know this is the main bubble emitter. Let's just go ahead and trim the fat here a little bit. Let's see what's happening. We have birth. 0, we know we need to, or I'd like to emit throughout the duration of the timeline. So that's 300. Not worried about the amount right now. Position's fine for now. Speed, I'll show you. If we switch it to the particles white, by default, usually the speed's just outrageous. I mean, these things are flying so fast. And in this case, I want more of a natural look. I'd rather the particles be driven by a force rather than a consistent speed. So I'll go ahead and delete speed because I'm not interested. Rotation, not thinking about right now. You can hide it by clicking on the icon. Or deactivate, I should say. Not interested in shape right now. So that puts us pretty much in a good position to go ahead and start building this beast up. First thing I want to do is kind of just get these bubbles to rise. And I will use a wind force. So if we go over to forces, and we go to wind. And what I like to do when I'm going to drop certain forces in the scene that don't have to be close to the system itself, is I like to go ahead and put it kind of in a grid square. Again, just for more organizational purposes. And so that's going to be our wind. And to start working with the wind, we have to add a force into our system here. So I drop a force in. I can add it by list, wind. And by default, I don't know what they're thinking, but they put influence to 1,000%. So I'd rather be a little more accurate to the numbers of the parameters in the force itself. So I do generally like to start at 100%. And if I need to make adjustments to the entire influence later, then that's fine. But starting at 100, and now I can go over to the wind. And the way I like to control wind, first of all, yeah, we have to get a feel for how fast it's going. By default, usually one's pretty fast. We're not getting accurate playback per se, but it's pretty close in the beginning phases before it gets too complicated. And we can see that that's just going way too fast. So I at least have some settings for the strength. I ended up going down to 0.12. And also what happens is the particles exponentially get faster and faster. So it's probably not that much allowance in the water. There's going to be a little more friction in there. So if we add a little bit of a decay, 0.07 is plenty. You can see the particles dropping. It just kind of keeps them going at more of a proper pace. Still lifting up, but just not ramping up as fast. Whenever I'm working with turbulence, this is interesting because turbulence, a lot of people are guessing the numbers and they're just like, let me just crank up the turbulence and let me just see if that's okay. I don't know. Is that okay? So the way I like to do it is just a little more controlled to kind of get an idea of how far these particles are going out of bounds and how much influence and frequency and scale we're dealing with when we're working with those attributes. So if I go to force, position icon, I want to change it from volume as far as where it's the particles are being emitted from to pivot. And if I switch it to pivot, it kind of draws a line, kind of telling me how crazy these particles are going to be based on my my settings. Sorry, navigation issues. So it's cool. So you're gonna get like more or less a trajectory of influence. So you can even crank up the particles. Let's do like 5,000, and it kind of almost like draws a line for you. This is the best way I've found I can control these things. So then if you're messing with frequency, you can start saying, holy cow, that one's that's getting crazy. Scale, okay. And you can even start typing numbers that really allow you to see what's going on. If we set it to 0 frequency, 0.3 turbulence, and scale to like 10. Kind of get an idea of what we're working with. Either way, in playing around with the numbers, I did come up with, that worked out really well for the bubble simulation that you guys saw, was I put my turbulence at 0.3, which is where I'm at. Frequency, which is really touchy, by the way. Be careful with frequency. And the scale ended up down to 0.75. So you can almost visually see kind of the trajectory of where these bubbles can go. And I do like to test it that way. This kind of pattern worked out well for me. And then once I was happy with that, now we can actually integrate the object itself. So for that, if we want to have the particles emit from the ocean floor, we're going to go ahead and switch it to a position object. And if we drag one of those in there, replace the icon, and again, we can do it by surface, or you can hit add, or by list, or you can hit add and just click on the surface itself. And obviously with 5,000 particles, it's going to look pretty crazy, but that's a lot of bubbles. That might be cool. Might be what you're going for. Fizzy drink. Anyway, so let's get this back under control. So 200 was fine when I was doing the actual bubbles themselves. And what we also want to do is control where the bubbles are coming from, where they're being emitted from. So it's not just emitting evenly across the surface of the floor. And in doing so, there's several ways you could do this. One of the ways I like to do it, or it's kind of fun to teach at least right now, is to have them emit from a value based on the texture that's on the ocean floor. So if we go to our material editor, we can kind of just create a quick procedural noise for ocean floor that then dictates where the bubbles are coming out from. It looks much more natural when you see bubbles actually come out of little cracks like you saw in the presentation video, and just kind of continuously coming out of kind of an air pocket underneath, in this case, underneath rocks or ocean floor or sand. So if we go to, just go ahead and pick a material, we can call it floor emit. Go to our diffuse slot and we'll choose noise. And right away, a plane naturally gives you UVs, so it's a little easier represented if we just go ahead and do explicit map channel, so we can actually see what the UVs are truly showing with the noise map that's applied to it. So we can go ahead and we have noise. I know we have to bring the size way down, so I have it set to, the size is set to 0.08. Sorry about that. 0.08. You can double click on it, kind of see what the map is doing. So this is currently what we're working with. And I kind of want to just really tighten it in, so there's just a few little spots on there that we're emitting bubbles from. And we can control that. First we could set a little more detail, so we'll do fractal to 10. And then the high and low range are clamping the values. So as you kind of close them in on each other, you can kind of reduce the value that's being shown. And whatever white the bubbles are able to actually emit from, and whatever black they're not. That's how the value emit will work. So what I came up with was 0.73. I know it sounds a little silly. 0.729. So they're just clamped to the max. We just have a couple little droplets around. And we can see what that looks like even now by just dropping this onto our surface. So once we have the general location of where we want our bubbles to be emitted from, we can go ahead and apply that by going to our position object here. And we click on where it says density by material and by emit from grayscale. So right away you can see it's like trying to do it is the best way I can describe it. But you'll see there's a lot of errors where particles are coming out of areas that aren't working right with the value. And a nice little fix, just kind of looks for errors and deletes the ones that are illegal, is if you go to if location is invalid, delete particles. And you'll see sure enough it cleans it up really nicely. So now all the particles are being emitted from the proper value scale. So that's pretty much it as far as getting our bubbles flowing right and getting the position, the amount down. And then we'll have to add all the additional details once we start integrating the look of the bubble. So I think from here we can move on to the actual geometry of the bubble. So instead of just adding basic spheres, which just don't have a lot of character to them, we just want to give it one more little push by actually instancing geometry from the scene as the bubble itself. I was going to switch from particle systems to standard primitives, and I'm going to go ahead and draw out a sphere, and this will be our bubble geometry. I'm just going to drop it in a grid square over here out of the way because we want to add some characteristics to it first and then attach it to the system, instancing it in. So we'll just do radius 2 and keep the segments as is. It looks fine. And we'll call it bubble geo. And again, I just want to animate it a little bit using a couple modifiers. And in this case, we're going to distort it, kind of creating a billow effect and kind of cycle that through to help out. So we're going to do an FFD 3x3. And we'll go ahead and turn on an auto key, and we're just going to animate a cycle within 30 frames. So I'm just going to move to frame 15 and grab the underbelly control point. And I'm just going to pull it right on through the top a little bit to kind of create this kind of billowing effect. And then to compensate for the volume, I'm just going to grab the middle vertices here and scale them outward like that. And then I could just grab that first keyframe over here on the bottom and shift drag it over to frame 30. And then to make sure it loops, we can go to the curve editor. And we're just going to find the control points. There they are. I'm just going to select all the control points and go to Edit, Controller, Out of Range Types, and just switch it to Loop. Get these little flags on the bottom. And say OK, close the editor. And now you'll see that we have a continuous loop. And then the next characteristic I want to add is kind of a huge noise on top that actually kind of gives the bubble its own turbulence outside of the system that we already created. Just for extra realism. So that, again, I'm just going to use a noise modifier. Should have just typed it in, but whatever. And we're going to do size 125, like a huge scale. Without auto key on, that'll help. 125. Fractal we're going to set to 2. And we're just going to add strength of 10 for each axis. And then we'll also make sure that's animated. So go to animate noise, and we'll turn on an auto key again, N. And we'll set this one to phases 125. Double check that the start is at 0. Perfect. And then we're just going to change the phase from to a linear interpolation, like we did before. And now we can see what we have. So our bubble's moving around pretty nice. It still looks a little robotic. I think I could find a better part of the wave in the noise modifier and the gizmo. Feel free to just grab your gizmo and just move it out to a different area and see if you actually get a better motion from it. There we go, that's much better. And from here, we'll go ahead and attach that to our particle system. So bring up the particle view. And we'll go to, let's go ahead and add a shape instance. Drop it in there. Actually, I want to drop it down here. And select our bubble geo. Inside our shape instance, a couple options we want to check on to make sure it's reading the animation is for the animate shape. And we want to set our animation offset keying to by particle age. So every time a bubble is emitted, it's actually just starting from its new cycle. So it'll kind of create some variation throughout the system. If I don't do that, then they're all going to be animating the exact same way as they go up. So let's see what we have. We'll switch our display from ticks to geometry. Cool. So they all look around the same size. The animation is working, so that's cool. Yeah, the bubbles look way too big, so we'll go ahead and change its scale. We'll bring it down about halfway, 50%, and we'll also add 50% variation. The more variation you add, just the more natural your bubbles will look. So that's better. And I also want to basically animate the scale of the bubbles as they're coming out of the cracks, if you will. They're growing. So to do that, we can actually add a scale, or we will add a scale node to our system. And I always add scale underneath our shape operator, in that I generally set the size I'm interested in with the shape, and then with the scale, it's usually I'm kind of doing something relative to that. So sure enough, you could set your scale to, instead of overriding it, we want to set to relative first. So it's listening to the first node, and now we're moving forward from there. So with that node, we can set it to animation offset keying to particle age, which basically allows us to add an animation in the timeline, and it'll actually attach that animation to each particle every time it's born. So with our scale, I'm going to go ahead and auto key. I just basically want the bubbles to come from nothing. So we'll do from 0, and then at frame 15, we'll set it back to 100%. And we can see how that's looking. So now you can see the bubbles are growing out in a little more of a natural way as they lift up. So that's pretty good right there. And then other thing we can do, so they don't actually have the same kind of motion path for every bubble, is go ahead and add back the rotation. And right here we have, it's set to random 3D, which will flip our bubbles all kinds of ways, as you can see here, which kind of defeats the purpose of creating the billowing effect of the force pushing from underneath the bubble. But we can get some randomness by switching it from random 3D to random horizontal, and now they're just kind of randomly oriented, just on the just horizontally. Looks good. So now we just need to start having it collide with the surface itself. So to do that, basically I want to have the bubble rise, go ahead and hit the collision surface and then pop into other particles to kind of finish the effect. So first we'll go ahead and create a deflector. So if you go to the create menu, we'll go to the forces tab and switch it from forces to deflectors. And we just need a standard deflector for this one, nothing fancy basically, because pretty much dealing with a plane, and deflector on its own right is basically a plane. So I'm just going to draw one out, and I'm just going to use my quick align to align it with the surface, and then just make sure I'm scaling it up a little bigger than the surface for any kind of runaway bubbles to make sure they do get popped. So once my deflector's in place here, I'm going to go ahead and add not just a collision, I want to add a collision spawn, because that's going to allow me to do two things at once. Allow the bubbles to get detected with the collision, and then also spawn a series of little, I'll just call them bubble bits from there. So we'll do collision spawn, drag it in there. And we will add our deflector. Okay, once our deflector's in, we have a couple kind of attributes we can change down here. By default, you can see what's happening as we scroll. They're kind of bouncing off the surface, and then kind of redoing the animation, they're regrowing from scratch. And the reason why they're doing that is because we animated their particle age to be at birth to be 0 up to 100. So because we have, it's checked on here, it says restart particle age, that's kind of the behavior you're going to get from that. So instead of that, let's go ahead and say continue. We don't want it to bounce. We want to go ahead and continue through. And we want it to kind of go to a new system, which then allows the bubble to pop. So I'll just start with a delete node and a blank area here and attach those two. And in this case, I'm going to set my delete to delete by particle age. And I just want a short lifespan. I'm just going to do a lifespan of 5 with just 2 variations. So ultimately up to 7 frames of killing the pop itself. Switch this to geometry, make sure we can see them. And in my collision spawn, we'll go ahead and set some parameters here. We have offspring. Let's go ahead and do 5. So when it pops, it'll pop into at least 5 bits. And we'll just do a 20% variation to change it up a little bit. And so we have continue. I want a little less speed. Inherited just means it's going to take the exact same force or speed that it already had and inherit 100% of it. So we're just going to drop it down a little bit. And we'll take it down to 65 with a variation of 15. And then I want to do divergence 90 degrees. Because currently our system or our bubble's facing straight up, so the angle's straight up. And then now I want to kind of make sure it's a little mini explosion that comes out and it fills the whole angle from the straight angle here to 90 degrees, which then happens all the way around 360. I hope that makes sense. So let's see what we have. And sure enough, they're hitting the top and popping nicely. They look a little big, so I want to bring them down. Let's bring them down to 85% scale factor. And then from there, I want them to actually pop and kind of get smaller into nothing. So same thing, we could just add a little scale node like we did before and animate it the same exact way. So scale, we'll drop it in. And again, I'm just going to say relative first, so it's listening to the first, or its original scale. And then from here, we'll do, let's auto key from 100 to, there's only 7 frames of its existence, so I'll just go to frame 7 to 0. And we have to make sure we change the animation offset keying from absolute time to particle age. So now it should look pretty good. Yep, they're all popping nicely and popping to 0. So one thing I want to make a quick note of is there is an order of operations need, I guess, over here in the event itself, in that I specifically put my shape and my scale underneath my collision, because I guess the order of operations essentially reads from top down. And again, I put scale underneath the shape so it can then read the relative first. So that is why I always put scale below shape. And then the collision, I've noticed it could just do something pretty funky. If I drag this and bring it down below my scale, it kind of has some hiccups, I guess, according to the actual scale animation we did. So just so I can show you guys real quick, kind of a little tip. Yeah, you can see at the bottom there's weird popping where it's showing, I guess, the full size frame of the bubbles being emitted, essentially creating glitches. So that's one thing I just want to make you guys aware of, is that go ahead and bring your collision and make sure it is above both your scale and your shape so the order of operations are sound. And the next thing I want to do is kind of add some secondary bubbles. They'll be a lot smaller, kind of travel a little slower to kind of emulate the breakaway from the main bubble and the little guys that might break away because of the turbulence or whatnot. So let's go ahead and create a spawn. I'm just going to drag it just up above the collision. And what we want to do is, again, just kind of create those secondary bubbles. And it's always good when you create the spawn to make sure your frames are at 0, because if you have more of a heavy system, it'll just seize up the whole thing. So I'm at frame 0, spawn, and we're going to go ahead and have bubbles emit rate per second, and we'll do 1.5. Offspring at 1 is good. And inherited, I want to bring it down to 25%, and a variation of 10, and just a divergence of 5. That'll be good. Our scale factor, I want to bring it way down, so I'm just going to go ahead and do down to 20% of the original size with 20% variation to kind of keep it easy. And I want to make sure that this spawn is going into another event, or else the new bubbles that form will also have their little babies, and then babies will make them babies, and then your system gets too heavy. So you have to make sure you bring an event. That's why it has a little test connector here for this circumstance. Actually, we'll just go ahead and grab the force from here, make a copy of it, and paste it in the new area, because we know we want to kind of apply the same force is fine. And then drag our spawn into that. Just to kind of clean up our naming a little bit, we know that these bubbles, this event 001 here, is for the pop, so we'll just call it pop to keep it easy. And then event 02 down here is our secondary bubbles. So we also want this to go ahead and collide with the surface as well. We don't need it to spawn the little guys, it's probably overkill. So I'm just going to grab a collision and drop it in. And I do, same thing with order of operations, I always bring my collisions under my forces so it can read the forces first and then apply the collisions. And we'll just add the deflector 001. And when it collides, we want it to basically die. So we're going to do the delete node. And drag it in there. So let's see what we have now. If we drag it. Okay, can't see them. So I'll just again make them white like I did with the other ones. And display geometry. Cool. Everything seems to be working. We have little secondary bubbles. They're trailing slightly behind. That just again will just kind of add to the effect. So from here we can go ahead and throw on some quick materials and do a little bit of lighting to kind of see our final result. So I'll go ahead and close this for now. And yeah, let's make a quick bubble material. So we'll go to a new material. We'll call this bubble. And we'll just change the color just to have a little bit of opacity to it, to kind of a watercolor. Just kind of a murky greenish is fine. It's not a big deal. And then opacity I can bring down to 15. And the main thing we're going to do is our specular level, and we're going to add a reflection map to the reflection area. And again, just trying to keep it super cheap. I'm using just standard materials, and again, the reflection map, I'm not ray tracing anything to up the calculations. It keeps it really, again, swift and fast for the purposes of a fast-paced generalist environment. So inside, let's go ahead and crank up the specular level. Let's just say 100, and we'll start with glossiness 50. And you'll see the little secondary highlight down here is also pretty circular. Oftentimes you kind of want to get a nice little rim light on it, and the blend function doesn't do too well with that. So I usually switch that one to Fong, and you can see the difference. It kind of adds a little arc to the highlight. Inside maps, just going to add a reflection map. You can grab any of your own kind of spherical reflection maps. It doesn't have to be an HDR. Just something that kind of mimics the idea of that the surface of the water is bright from the sky and underneath is this, a little disheveled or whatever. So I just grabbed the image off the internet, and it seemed to work pretty well. And you can see by default, it looks like a mirror. It's over reflective. So I want to kind of create a little of that Fresnel effect. And for that, we can convert this bitmap to a fall off and control it a little more through that. So if I go to bitmap, switch it to fall off, keep old map as submap. I'll go ahead and swap these two and put my front color back to black. So now you can kind of see the reflection tapers or is added closer to the edges. And we can do, you could do a couple modifications, and it's all preference at this point. I'm just kind of giving you guys a quick demonstration. But if you go to the mix curve, you can kind of go to extremes and push the Fresnel all the way to the edges. And you can have a nice kind of crispy edged bubble there. You can increase the output if you want just more of an extreme cartoony bubble, however you want to handle that. I'm going to go back to keeping it pretty modest. And I'll just do like maybe 1.1. And yeah, that for the most part is our bubble material. We can work with that. And then what worked out pretty well is once the bubbles are popping on the surface, I noticed if I used the exact same material, it seemed to just be a little too blown out, a little too heavy, a little too noticeable, if you will. So I want to kind of create the subtle effect. So before I move on, I just basically want to duplicate this material to serve as our material for our pop bubbles. And that you can just drag over, and you just have to make sure you rename it. And I'll just call this bubble pop. And in doing that, I'm just decreasing the opacity down to 5. Specular level, let's just go down to 50. Kind of just halving everything. 50, 50, 50. So you can see there's a decrease in intensity there. So that one worked out pretty well. So we'll go ahead and apply these materials to our particle system. And let's go back over here and let's go ahead and create a material. I'm going to choose material static because I don't need anything fancy. I'm not trying to cycle through a multi-material, or I'm not trying to add a dynamic material which can fade out over time. So this wasn't necessary for this one, so I'm using material static. And we'll just drop it down here and drag in our bubble. Assign it, instancing it. I could use the same one for the little guys, so I'm just going to copy and paste it. And then I'm also going to copy and paste, but switch this one to the bubble pop material. Like that. Cool, so that should be in place. We can take a look. A little hard to see for you guys, but everything's working good. And I'm just going to add a little bit of lighting, and we'll get a couple renders going. For now, I'm just going to go ahead and go to object properties on our two surfaces and make them non-renderable so they don't really get in my way. And we'll go ahead and to the create tab, and we're going to create some lights. I'm just going to go standard, keep it real simple. I'll just do target direct for simplicity, and go ahead and create my key light. And I'll just call it key. Increase my cone a little bit, and just kind of standard 3-point lighting. This will be 2, but that's the idea, is you kind of upper left off to the side a little bit. Intensity should be okay. We can bump it up a little bit, maybe 1.2. And then I'll go ahead and create a rim light, so we can kind of mimic how our material is behaving. Same kind of thing. And I'm just going to bring it down pretty far into the back area so we can just kind of create that nice little rim lighting. So from there we can kind of see what we have. Do a little quick render. And that's it. And they look pretty good. From here you just generally want to kind of mess around with your material settings to get the certain look you want. So if we go to our camera view, just kind of basically see what we ended up with. Stretch out my nose, make it a little more watery. And it's a little hard to see the floor right now, so I'll go ahead and grab, if I can, grab the surface, and I'm going to just show you a quick little last tip, and then we're pretty much done. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate the floor. For now, I'm going to hide the other one and show you basically how we can go ahead and take, let's just go ahead and apply a material to it. And I just want to kind of show you how we can use that same procedural map we used to kind of develop where the bubbles were coming from, and also just kind of give an indication on the surface itself, so you can kind of see how I developed the presentation from here. So I'm just going to add a little turbo smooth, a couple iterations, and then a displacement map. And basically I want to just drop that same map we used to put on the floor originally and bring it into the map slot. And then just bring the strength down to, let's just say, -1. And here you can kind of see how I was able to form those divots using the same map. So the bubbles are now coming up from there. Got another couple turbo smooths. Smooth it out a little bit. We could even add another displace just to kind of get a little of that sandy look. Again, you could probably just use a bump map and all that. I'm just doing this fast. So add a noise. Do a little fractal levels 10 and just drop that one in the new displacement we have. And I'll just do 0.1. Just give it a little something to work with. And there you go. That's pretty much it. Kind of see the whole system working. The bubbles are coming out from underneath. Well, it's lagging a little bit because I shouldn't be playing this in real time at this point. But that concludes my 3ds Max underwater bubble tutorial. And yeah, thank you all. And until next time, but meanwhile, get the job done.